right, y'all. Welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I am the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and I've recorded more than 5,000 interviews going back to 2003, all of which are available at scotthorton.org. You can also sign up for the podcast feed. The full archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. All right, you guys, introducing Ali Abunimah from electronicintifada.net and author of The Battle for Justice in Palestine and One Country, a bold proposal to end the Israeli-Palestinian impasse. And, well, he has a bunch of important articles here to talk about, but we'll start here with Israel lobby sees Black Lives Matter as a major strategic threat. Welcome back to the show, Ali. How are you doing?
It's good to be back. Thank you for having me.
Very happy to have you here. So, how ironical that just this morning an email friend sent me a copy of this study that you also linked to in here, I guess just from last year, reflecting a real concern on the part of the Israel lobby that all this Black Lives Matter stuff is going to essentially wash over into the Israel lobby or Israel-Palestine debate, essentially, and that if there's this whole new push for civil rights for blacks in America, that maybe people will start equating blacks in America with Palestinians in Palestine and the way that they're being treated in, obviously, you know, essentially Jim Crow or worse type conditions there. And so what can they do about that? It has nothing to do, of course, with solving the problems of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, just focusing, of course, on how to spin it. But the larger reality that they're afraid of is one thing, and then their fear of it is another. So I guess, you know, recent developments have obviously, kicked those same sentiments into higher gear here. So what have you found?
Well, that's exactly right. That's a good summary. Of course, this is not a new concern, but there's a couple of things that have happened in the last few years that have really made this really sort of a code red for the Israel lobby. And it really goes back to 2014, to the Ferguson Uprising, when, of course, police in Ferguson, Missouri killed the black teenager Michael Brown. And that was the same summer that Israel was bombing Gaza in this massive campaign, which killed 2,200 Palestinians, including 551 children in the space of 51 days. And you saw this explosion of solidarity between Palestinians and black people in the United States, and a lot of identification between protesters in the streets of Ferguson and around the country. And one of the issues that really came to the fore at that time for many activists was the fact that practically every major U.S. police force, and also this includes not just the big cities like Chicago and New York and Los Angeles, but, you know, many medium-sized provincial cities have been sending for many years top officers to Israel for so-called counter-terrorism training. And these trainings are usually sponsored. These are all expenses paid junkets that are usually sponsored by the major Israel lobby groups. This includes specifically AIPAC, the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, and others. And these police chiefs then come back to the United States and they will issue press releases saying, oh, we went to Israel and we learned from the best of the best, and we need to apply the lessons that we learned in Israel to our cities. This was particularly popular. I mean, it's been going on for decades, but it sort of took a huge boost in the post 9/11 sort of war on terror atmosphere, where Israel is marketed as this, you know, we know how to do this. We've been dealing with terrorists for so long. And of course, it was also very much about selling Israeli so-called counter-terrorism technologies, surveillance technologies, and other kinds of, intrusive systems to American federal, state, and local police forces. So it was also a huge marketing opportunity for Israel's arms industry. But what happened with the Ferguson Uprising is people said, wait a minute, why are our police who are murdering uh, innocent people on the streets of American cities being trained in Israel? So it highlighted this really nefarious relationship, and that has been a major point of rallying and organizing ever since then. And just very briefly, you alluded to a report I cited in my article in the Electronic Intifada. There have been several reports from Israel lobby groups. Some are what you would call open source, where they published them. But there have also been leaked reports. There was one from the Anti-Defamation League and the Reut Institute, which is a major Israeli think tank, that was leaked in 2017, I believe. It was either 2017 or 18. We published the whole thing at the Electronic Intifada, where they actually talk about the Black Lives Matter movement and particularly intersectionality as a huge long-term threat to support for Israel, because heaven forbid oppressed groups, whether it's Black people in the United States or Palestinians, get together and realize their collective strength and common interests. And that really is the gist of the worry of the Israel lobby. And so now you see all these major pro-Israel groups who are in this difficult, awkward position of having to basically pretend to be, supportive of Black Lives Matters while also upholding their staunch support for Israeli racism and brutality against Palestinians.
Mm-hmm. Well, and of course, the key to that is portraying all opposition to Israel as anti-Semitism. And never mind the Palestinians, they don't even exist at all. There's only one reason to ever criticize Israel, and that would be as cover for your anti-Semitic emotions.
Quite right. And it's also about portraying, anyone who challenges their power and authority as criminal, as terrorist, as a threat. And I think this mindset very much mirrors what has been going on in American policing since 9/11 with the increased militarization. Of course, people are talking that a lot. The Obama administration and the Bush administration handing over huge amounts of military weaponry to local police forces. But also the mindset, because a lot of the people who are in U.S. police forces now are people who took part in American invasions and occupations of Iraq, Afghanistan, and other countries. So there is a whole mindset of counterinsurgency where instead of seeing the civilian public as people they are charged with serving and protecting, as the slogan goes, they see them as an enemy. And that also is very much, I don't want to say it necessarily comes from the Israelis, but it is a very much a shared value or shared worldview, that we're not talking about protecting civilian populations. We're talking about viewing them as enemies, controlling them, corralling them, defeating them. And that's really how U.S. cities are policed.
Yeah. Now, on that last point there, just about the number of people who've come home from the wars, and essentially that's their skill set. It's not helicopter repairman like in the recruitment pitch on TV. It's deputy sheriff or city policeman is essentially, the kind of runner-up position when you get home from the war. And I remember there was one in the Austin Chronicle, this story about a cop who, I think the guy had been popping cars or something like that, burglarizing cars. And the cops chasing the guy through the grocery store parking lot, just shooting at him wildly. And one of the bullets had gone through the back of the minivan and through the car seat. And luckily the baby was inside the store with its mom. But would have been killed. And the cop was fired for it. It was so reckless. The cop was actually fired, APD here in Austin. And he admitted that, you know what? It was like I was back in Iraq in a firefight with the enemy and these kind of rules of engagement. Never mind. He's in our neighborhood in the grocery store parking lot. You know, not that Iraqis' lives ought to be any more forfeit, but that's where he came back from. And then that was how he was treating us.
Certainly.
Just that was his experience. That's who he was by then, you know?
Yeah. Correct. Yeah. And what I'm saying is there's no excuse for that behavior. But, you know, the poor guy could have been having some kind of flashback. In other words, we're putting people who have also been in, traumatic situations with the amount of PTSD and traumatic brain injury and what have you. And then you're going to give them guns and put them on the streets. That really is a crazy mindset in terms of American policing. But it's one, and I want to be very clear because I've written a lot about this issue of Israel's sort of relationship with U.S. policing and so on. I think my book, The Battle for Justice in Palestine, published in 2014, is the first book to really treat this as a topic. It's not the whole book, but I have a whole chapter on that. And I think that was the first time it had been written about at that length. Since then, we've seen a lot more attention to it, which is fantastic. But what I'm saying is I certainly don't want anyone to come away with the impression that American police learned racism from Israel. That is not the case at all. We know that the roots of American policing go back to, to slave overseeing and to finding runaway slaves and to Jim Crow. So the American police in general has nothing to learn from anyone in terms of how to be racist. But what I am saying is that certainly in particular after 9/11, what we see is Israel providing a kind of a legitimation and a cover for this kind of racism and dressing it up as expertise. And one example of that I wrote about then was this sort of airport. You remember back when, airport security was the major thing. They trialed this. They ran pilot programs in Boston Airport and a couple of others as well, where it was supposedly some sophisticated technique where they could tell by, I don't know, the way your eyes moved or the way you were looking, whether you were a terrorist or not. You know, it was supposedly this very, very sophisticated technique. And they hired the former head of security from Ben Gurion Airport to run this thing in Boston and in other airports. He had his own company, of course, by this point. And I think the Department of Homeland Security has spent like $1 billion on this program. And not only was it absolutely useless, but a number of TSA, Transport Security Administration, agents blew the whistle and actually said this was nothing but racial profiling. We were just told basically, if we saw a black person who was kind of dressed too fancy, their clothes looked quote unquote too expensive for how we think a black person should dress, you'd stop them. If we saw a Latino person, we'd stop them. And it was also about like trying to find people who were carrying drugs, which is not the job of the TSA. The job of the TSA is the security and safety of aircraft. So what it was, again, it was just sheer racism, but now you can dress it up as this very sophisticated Israeli technology. Yeah. And that's a lot of what has been happening.
Yeah, so that was one thing I was going to ask you was, and I hope people will get the book, but I was going to say, so what really is the best bit of journalism about the effect? Because as you mentioned, there have been a lot of reports of cops going to Israel and coming back and sort of correlations and causations made, but who has really the best piece about that really shows the change? They go to Israel, they come back, and now they start driving their armored personnel carrier around more, or now they treat jaywalkers with more force or whatever the actual change is.
Yeah, well, we actually have to be careful about that because what we're not seeing, I mean, I saw people passing around following the murder of George Floyd, that the Minneapolis Police Department had sent a delegation to Israel a couple of years ago, and they had, that's true. But on the whole, these are not, this isn't low-level stuff. It's not like we have, rank and file street cops going to Israel and being trained in chokeholds. That's not what's happening. So, when we say cops are trained in Israel or by Israel, I think we have to be careful not to sort of think, well, oh yeah, cops are going and they're being taught how to arrest people or how to shoot people. It's really the upper level and the management who are going to Israel. And I think it's creating a mindset in addition to, as I mentioned, a market, a very lucrative market for Israeli technologies and that kind of thing. So it's really about a mindset. And I think that there is need for, to answer that question of what is the impact of this, that's a good question. I don't think there has been enough research on that. One piece, though, that I think is important that was done, I did mention my book, that's a few years. Since then, there is a campaign that has been started by Jewish Voice for Peace called Deadly Exchange. And they're talking about the relationship between U.S. police forces and Israeli security forces as a deadly exchange. And their website is deadlyexchange.org. And they actually have a research report there that sort of outlines a lot of what we know about what's going on.
Cool.
And this, by the way, doesn't just include local police forces. It includes ICE, Border Patrol, the FBI, and in fact, the federal government has been one of the biggest customer for, these kinds of Israeli surveillance and spying technologies, which you have to remember are all tested on Palestinians under military occupation. So the Palestinians are the guinea pigs under military occupation, robbed of any rights. And these Israeli technologies of control, of occupation, of oppression are tested and refined on Palestinians and then sold to the world as Israeli prowess at great profit, by the way. So it's not just a question of what impact this is having in American cities or along the border, as important as that is. It's also a moral question of Israeli companies and their complicit American and other firms profiting from basically experimentation on a captive population.
Right. Okay, now, so some of that has to do with actual weapons, like in the occasional attacks on Gaza, but then also there's the surveillance technologies that they use against Palestinians and that kind of thing. So to bring it back around, I'd like to give you a chance to really talk about how the Palestinians live under the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli occupation on the West Bank, and then also under Hamas and the siege in the Gaza Strip. Talk about some of those technologies and the experimentation on the Palestinians that you mean to, give people something to hang on to back that up there. And then we can bring it back around to why it would be that civil rights activist types in America would start to see themselves in the Palestinians and would start to see why, if Black Lives Matter, maybe Palestinian ones do too, and why that's such a cause for alarm for the Israelis, because they sure can't fix the problem,
Right. Well, I mean, one very specific example, I'll give you a couple. One is an Israeli firm called AnyVision, which received a huge investment from Microsoft, I think about $80 million or so. And thankfully, Microsoft just announced that they were planning to divest from it following an activist campaign. Because what AnyVision was doing is they basically, they have been supplying biometric facial recognition technology to Israeli army checkpoints in the occupied West Bank. And also it's been reported that they were basically using the Palestinian population without any consent, without any ability to opt out whatsoever. Remember, Palestinians are under military occupation. They have no rights whatsoever. Using the Palestinian population going through the checkpoints to refine and develop the face recognition technology. I mean, this is really sinister. It is absolutely disgusting. So disgusting that even Microsoft divested from it once they, investigated what was going on. So
I want to chip in here real quick just on how you characterize the relationship of the power there. There's Major Todd Prince, who's a former JAG lawyer in the Army and all that, has written extensively about this and how what we think of as martial law, where the civilian authorities completely suspended and a general can issue an order like anyone who resists any order at all will be shot on sight, this kind of thing, that the Palestinians are occupied under, as Prince says, the Palestinians are occupied under war law, which is a whole other level of lawlessness beyond martial law. We're talking about a foreign occupying army. And under that law, the power is that much less accountability than even under martial law, which you would think of as absolute lawless military dictatorship.
Yeah, it's zero accountability. If you're Palestinian, you can be shot dead with total impunity by Israeli soldiers and settlers. There are very, very, very rare cases where Israeli soldiers or settlers are held accountable for killing Palestinians. The norm is that they kill Palestinians with total impunity, which means you have to look at it from the other side. As a Palestinian living under military occupation, you have no right to life because there's no law protecting you. You're not allowed to defend yourself. You can be killed with impunity. And those are the conditions under which Israel is experimenting on Palestinians. The surveillance technology, the face recognition, the drones. And now the second example I wanted to give you is in the context of the pandemic, of the coronavirus, which I take very seriously. We all have to take it seriously. It's a real thing, and we need to control it. We need to deal with it. But I think people have very rightly been alarmed by how, this has also been an opportunity for governments and corporations to expand surveillance. And so we've seen Israeli companies. We saw a company called NSO Group, which is notorious for hacking WhatsApp, for hacking the telephone. For example, they're involved in the hacking of the telephone of Jamal Khashoggi just before he was murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. So this company, NSO Group, works for the worst governments in the world, for the Saudis, for the UAE, where basically they can hack anyone's smartphone and get all their information and eavesdrop on them. They've been condemned by all the major human rights groups, all the major civil rights groups in the world, you name it. So in the context of COVID-19, NSO Group tried to rebrand itself as, oh, look, we can help governments to track the coronavirus using, cell phone apps. I mean, these are the last people you want anywhere near your mobile phone. And in fact, it turns out that because Palestinians under occupation have Israel has destroyed their economy, doesn't allow them to operate their own economy. Tens of thousands of Palestinian workers are forced to go and work in Israel, as laborers, construction laborers in fields, a very similar setup to how our economy is structured with migrant labor. But Palestinians, in the context of coronavirus, Israel said, okay, if you want a permit to come in and work, you must download this app onto your phone, supposedly under the cover of coronavirus. But it turns out this app, as was reported by Israeli media, can access their camera, can access their photos, can access all kinds of stuff that has nothing to do with nothing to do with tracking the coronavirus. I haven't seen. I suspect that this app is from NSO Group or a company like it, And again, this is an example of Palestinians with no power being used as unwitting guinea pigs for technologies that will then be marketed in Europe and the United States, and not just marketed, but welcomed. Our officials and leaders will say, oh, the Israelis are the best of the best, so of course we want to buy whatever they're selling.
Yeah. Hold on just one second. Be right back. So you're constantly buying things from Amazon.com. Well, that makes sense. They bring it right to your house. So what you do, though, is click through from the link in the right-hand margin at scotthorton.org, and I'll get a little bit of a kickback from Amazon's end of the sale. Won't cost you a thing. Nice little way to help support the show. Again, that's right there in the margin at scotthorton.org. Hey, y'all, check it out. The Libertarian Institute, that's me and my friends, have published 3 great books this year. First is No Quarter, The Ravings of William Norman Grigg. He was the best one of us. Now he's gone, but this great collection is a truly fitting legacy for his fight for freedom. I know you'll love it. Then there's Coming to Palestine by the great Sheldon Richman. It's a collection of 40 important essays he's written over the years about the truth behind the Israel-Palestine conflict. You'll learn so much and highly value this definitive libertarian take on the dispossession of the Palestinians and the reality of their brutal occupation. And last but not least is the great Ron Paul, The Scott Horton Show Interviews 2004 through 2019. Interview transcripts of all of my interviews of the good doctor over the years on all the wars, money, taxes, the police state, and more. So how do you like that? Pretty good, right? Find them all at libertarianinstitute.org/books. You need stickers for your band or your business? Well, Rick and the guys over at thebumpersticker.com have got you covered. Great work, great prices, sticky things with things printed on them. Whatever you need, thebumpersticker.com will get it done right for you. Thebumpersticker.com. Well, and so to bring it back to the comparison to the United States of America, I mean, this really is like Jim Crow before the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts of the 60s. And maybe even worse than that, maybe back to the Wilson years or something. I mean, this is the situation that the Palestinians are in. I mean, there are people from apartheid South Africa who say that, no, this is worse than what we were living in back then.
Yeah, and in a way, it's worse because the brutality is brutality. At the end of the day,
yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that American blacks have it lucky. I'm just saying these guys have it worse. That's all.
Well, what I want to say is at the end of the day, all of these racist systems are enforced at the barrel of a gun. That's what it comes down to, no matter how you dress it up. But what Israel is really, the South African rulers could only dream of the level of sophistication and technology that Israel brings to surveillance and brings to total control. And I think that the Palestinians are the canary in a coal mine in so many ways, because what is done to them, it will follow to many people in the world afterwards. And we've seen that pattern consistently, particularly because Israel is so determined to market what it's doing. Israel's not ashamed of what it's doing to the Palestinians. That's something to understand. It's saying, look how well we do this, and we can help you do it too. And so, repressive governments around the world, and even supposedly liberal governments, European governments, are turning to Israel for drone technology, for surveillance technology, for all kinds of systems of control that, again, have been developed in the most oppressive circumstances. What do you think the long-term impact that is going to be of that on civil liberties and human freedom around the world? Is technologies developed in those circumstances likely to make you more free or less free?
Yeah. All right. Now, I want to talk, I want to let you talk about the story of Iyad Halak here, which I read Gideon Levy's take that you linked to in your piece. Again, your piece is called Israel Lobby Sees Black Lives Matter as a Major Strategic Threat. And in there you link to this, let's see, it's under pleaded for his life is the link to the Gideon Levy piece telling this story. But if you could take people through this a little bit, I think the parallel's pretty obvious.
Yeah, Iyad Halak, it's just such a horrible uh, tragedy. Iyad Halak was Palestinian, 32 years old, with autism and some intellectual disabilities. And he attended a special school in Jerusalem. He'd been attending for 6 years. He absolutely loved it in occupied East Jerusalem. And he was on his way to school a couple of weeks ago with his caregiver. This was, I think, on June 1st or thereabouts. And he was simply chased through the streets of Jerusalem by Israeli occupation soldiers and gunned down. The soldiers claimed later that they thought he had a gun. He didn't. Or that they had heard there was a terrorist on the loose in the area and he just happened to be coming by. But the details of his killing, which were investigated by Gideon Levy and also by the Palestinian human rights group Al Haq, which issued a detailed report on his killing, is that, the Al Haq report reveals that the soldiers had been told numerous times by the caregiver, he is disabled, he is not armed, do not shoot him. He's deaf. I mean, he had difficulty. I don't know if he was deaf. I have to verify that, but he has difficulty understanding orders. He had spoken previously of his fear of the soldiers, so that he ran away from. He was terrified. Then they cornered him in a room where garbage dumpsters were stored, and essentially executed him. And it's just a horrific story. Now, it was so egregious, and I guess the publicity for Israel around it was so bad that even the Israeli prime minister called it a tragedy. Now, that is so deceptive because by doing that and by commenting on it, Netanyahu is trying to give the impression that this is something unusual, that this sort of thing never really happens. But in fact, it happens all the time. And the day before Iyad Halak had been killed, another Palestinian was driving through a checkpoint in the West Bank, and he was shot to death by the Israeli army, who claimed he was trying to carry out a car ramming attack. His family says he was just on his way to pick up his wife. But this has happened again and again. We have examples of Palestinians. There was an example a couple of years ago of a group of teenagers who were on their way to a swimming pool party in the West Bank, and Israeli soldiers just opened up on the car and killed several of them. So this is happening with frequency, and there is zero accountability. Zero. In the past 50 odd years, there have been, you could count on one hand the number of Israeli soldiers or police who've been tried and convicted for unlawful killings of Palestinians. And usually, if in the rare event that happens, it's a slap on the wrist that they get. It might be a few months in prison, if that. So that's the case of Iyad Halak coincided with the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and I think again highlighted for many people the similarities, if you like, the shared values of the United States and Israel.
Yeah, and it could stand in for almost any police shooting on any day of the week here in the U.S., but it's always particularly egregious when it's a retarded guy, who they say that this guy was a mental 2-year-old or 3-year-old. His family said that about him.
I wouldn't use those terms, but there is a history of Israel killing people with disabilities, and there seems to be a pattern that suggests that it is willful. There have been cases of, for example, Ibrahim Abu Thuraya in 2017, who was a double amputee, who was basically executed in his wheelchair while he was taking part in a protest in Gaza near the boundary fence. everyone could see. The soldiers apparently knew him because he was a regular at the protests. He's a double amputee in a wheelchair, and all he was doing was waving a flag. They shot him from, a long distance away. There's no conceivable way by which he could have been a threat. He was killed for sport because they know they can do it and get away with it. And this has been a repeated pattern, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I'm sorry to change the subject for a second, but can you give us an update on the Friday marches at the Gaza gate, the Gaza so-called fence? Is that still going on?
It hasn't been going on because, of course, the pandemic.
Yeah. It was going on up until then, though?
It was going on and off. I mean, it had cooled down, but I think there had been intentions to revive the protests. But with the pandemic, that became impossible. So for now, it seems it's not taking place. But Palestinians have been, looking for other ways to make their voices heard, and it's always a challenge given the media environment, which is loath to give attention to anything that is critical of Israel. But they do try.
Yeah, I remember one time Thomas Friedman was criticizing something or other that the Palestinians had done, and said that instead what they should do is all the Gazans should just march unarmed to the border and say, "Let me in a peaceful civil disobedience kind of a way, and then the Israelis will just have no choice but to start treating them fairly then."
Well, actually what he said, and I think Nick Kristof said something similar, and in fact this is just such a tiresome trope from these liberal blowhards, is that, if the Palestinians launch this mass movement, nonviolent movement, then the whole world will rally to their support. Well, lo and behold, not even the columnists who wrote those columns rallied to their support.
Right.
So they're such hypocrites. And it's the same with the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement. Here is a global nonviolent movement to bring pressure on Israel and companies complicit in its crimes, the same way that people boycotted lunch counters and the Montgomery bus boycott, and how we boycott North Carolina or Georgia or whatever state is passing some law against a particular segment of the population. Not only do they not support BDS, but they condemn it. So it's just hypocrisy. It's a way for them to get off the hook, to always blame the Palestinians, to say, well, you're not protesting right. You're not resisting right. If only you do a bit more of this, a bit less of that. And of course, the Palestinians, just like African Americans, can never do right in the eyes of these liberal hypocrites who really are not interested in fundamentally changing the power relationship.
Yeah. Well, in a way, I'm kind of dubious about all this intersectional of victimhood of all of these things where, the race to define oneself as most oppressed and all of that. But at the same time, I do get the point here that...
Yeah, but that's not what's going on. I mean, okay, look.
Well, on Twitter. But anyway, I was going to say, it's clear
right.
that there's value here in saying that, look, instead of having to divide activist pressure and take away from, say, Black Lives Matter types, that it's everybody chipping in together and helping each other. And so the pro-Palestinian factions side with Black Lives Matter, and hopefully the Black Lives Matter will side with the Palestinians as well, and this kind of thing. And so it's a mutually beneficial kind of a deal. I get that.
Yeah, and it's more than that's, of course, important. Solidarity is important, but it's also more than that. It's beginning to understand that the systems that oppress us are linked. The same companies that are involved in, mass surveillance in the United States are involved in it in Israel, or are developing their technologies in Israel. The same companies that make what's it called, combined tactical systems in Pennsylvania, which is where most of the tear gas and the rubber-coated metal bullets that Israel fires at Palestinians, these things can be lethal, and they have been lethal. These are being fired at Americans all over the country now for protesting. So it's about understanding the connections, and that really none of us by ourselves or as particular communities or groups have the power or the wherewithal to defeat these systems by ourselves. So it's not just about, wouldn't it be nice to be in solidarity with each other, but that kind of solidarity becomes a necessity if we're serious about trying to change these realities.
Yeah. Well, and it is important to short circuit the, media, of course, is their constant attempt to divide everyone on as many things as possible and force people to compete over whatever attention and that kind of thing, that instead work together and negate all those incentives that, divide people from each other when they ought to be helping.
Exactly right.
Yeah. All right. Well, listen, I love your website. We run as much as your stuff as we can at antiwar.com, and it's always great to talk to you, Ellie. Appreciate it.
Likewise, and thanks for having me. And I really do appreciate the seriousness with which you and anti-war take this issue, because a lot of people don't want to take it on, and that kind of, we don't always agree on every single issue. That's not important. The willingness to talk about these things is crucial, and I think that's where courage lies in this day and age. So thank you for doing that.
Absolutely. Right on. Well, talk to you again soon. Appreciate it.
All right. Take care. Bye.
All right, you guys. That is Ali Abunimah. He runs electronicintifada.net. And this one is called Israel Lobby Sees Black Lives Matter as Major Strategic Threat. And if you wanted to read that hilarious PR publication about the Zionist panic here, it's called Navigating Intersectional Landscapes, Rules for Jewish Community Professionals. I think you'll get a hoot. The Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, APSradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.